Okay, welcome everyone to the Overseas Press Club's new series of Zoom conversations with winners of our 22 annual awards. This is the fifth one that we've done. It's for the David Kaplan Award, and that's for Best TV or Video Spot News Reporting from Abroad. And it was won by a Vice News Tonight team, 3 of whom are here. And the show was Uganda Orphanage Inc. And the moderator is Terry McCarthy, and he's from the American Society of Cinematographers. He was the head judge of this award, so he knows why the story was so important and why it won the award. So over to you, Terry.
Thanks, Patricia, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by the Vice News crew who made this great story. We had, if I'm not mistaken, about 50 submissions, but this story really stood out. It was an extraordinary story, one that it came from out of left field, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but just it sort of revealed this enormous scam of orphanages that are being supported by money from the United States and elsewhere, and really kind of using kids, a lot of whom are not even orphans. They're kids that are taken from families who think their kids will get better education as a way of churning money. And of course, a lot of the money gets diverted, as we'll discover. But I thought I'd just introduce real quickly our panel. Joe Hill was the associate producer and the researcher who actually initially discovered this story, and we'll talk to him first about how that story happened. And he's joined by Julia Lindau, who is the producer, and Hind Hassan, who is the correspondent who went to Uganda to report the story. So maybe, Joe, if you could just tell us how you came on this story, because it's quite an interesting tale of how you actually found this story.
Yeah, of course. So it was kind of interesting. I had a colleague or a friend who was working in the region and who had been doing some really interesting reporting about like adoptions and some of the other sort of issues around like in orphanages and the way that, you know, Westerners were coming and funding them, or the way that Westerners were coming to adopt kids from Uganda. And so we started talking, and the government had basically announced that they were going to start shutting down these illegally run orphanages. So there's a new process to try and get, you know, to make your orphanage legal. But there was also these sort of raids or these operations where probation officers would show up and, you know, try and close down these ones that were legal. And so I guess it kind of started as just being interested in what those raids were, and, you know, what made an orphanage illegal versus legal, and, you know, how did they sort of distinguish those, and also, you know, how are so many people donating and sort of financially supporting illegal orphanages. And so my colleague in Uganda, Anna Cavell, like started sort of chasing down some answers from the government, and then I started sort of chasing down some answers from the foreign sort of donor side in the US. I guess the kind of development was that once we, once we started chasing this, like it ended up being a little bit, a lot of things sort of changed and unfolded on the ground. We sort of set out to just be on one of these raids and understand what that was, but it just became really complicated as we found, you know, like we weren't sure what would happen to the kids when they were released, or like if there was an orphanage raided and closed, what would happen to those kids? And we started learning about, there was just like a lot of things that ended up sort of coming out through this investigation that really made the story what it was.
So then Julia and Hind, you went to Uganda and you started to report the story. The story, as you produced it, starts with a very creepy sequence of well, I guess of on-the-fly interviews with this one Canadian gentleman who is in some position of authority in one of the orphanages. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that made you feel about the way this whole orphanage industry, as you've been terming it, is sort of run? Julia, you want to jump in there?
Sure. Or did you want to start, Hind?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, basically we stumbled upon this orphanage last minute, trying to find another example of foreigners who were in country supporting and volunteering at places. We actually found this orphanage on Google Maps. And as soon as we arrived, we had an uneasy feeling because we didn't know what to expect, obviously. And we saw this man who didn't appear like what we expected and encountered other volunteers to be, which is younger, do-gooder, oftentimes missionary type people who come to Uganda to work with children. And I actually saw him kind of scolding the people who run the orphanage for letting us come. But as soon as we went inside, we realized that something was off. The way, he interacted with the children, held the children, the way the kids kind of almost went, didn't really react to him touching them or picking them up. It was an extremely uncomfortable and eerie experience. And I think Hind can talk a little more about, her direct interactions with him when she interviewed him.
Yeah, Hind, talk to us about that, because one of the things that made your story stand out from all of the entries for this award was quite clearly a lot of the reporting was done very spontaneously. You clearly hadn't planned for this, and yet you ran with it. I'm wondering what was running through your mind as you're sitting next to this creepy guy and you're trying to work out what's going on in this weird orphanage.
Well, actually, before we got to this orphanage, I think we were all a bit tired and struggling at that point, because we'd come out after Joe had done a lot of research. We knew that something had existed. We knew that there were these orphanages that were being run illegally and that had children there that weren't orphans, and that was being run illegally. But a couple of the orphanages that we'd checked out originally didn't really fit the bill completely. And so it was a lot of hard work by Julia and the team that was working on it at the time to try and find one of these orphanages, because obviously a lot of them are off the grid. So you won't find them on a website, you won't find them on Facebook or social media. And so we had to contact a lot of people and word of mouth. And then, as Julia says, she found this one that was located on Google Maps as an orphanage, and she gave them a call, and we'd called a lot of orphanages and we had some leads, but some of them didn't want to be filmed or were very suspicious of journalists coming around. And then she convinced us to go, after we'd been working a lot of hours, many days, and we were all a bit cranky and not wanting to go out and film that evening, but she convinced us to go along. And it was the two DOPs that were with us, as well as the translator and the driver, and Zach Caldwell and Daniel Bateman. And when we got there, it was in the evening, and we just saw a man stood at the door that we didn't expect to look the way that he did. In my head, I envisaged someone, who was traveling and younger and perhaps trying to, do some charity work. So he didn't fit the bill, but regardless, what really shocked us was also the state of the orphanage as you walk in, as you drive in, the children that were there, and the way that he was interacting with the children. And there were a lot of things that just struck us very, very quickly, that this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel that this is how children should be looked after in these orphanages. And so the two directors of photography, Zach and Dan, they just got their cameras rolling straight away, and we just decided to do a lot of the filming just as we went along. And some of the conversations that are in that top piece is just me having a conversation with him, and then Dan and Zach will just join in and start filming and rolling. And obviously he was well aware that he was being filmed, but he just continued and engaged with us, surprisingly. And there's a lot of things that didn't actually make it into the piece. So, how the children were sleeping, where they were sleeping. And yeah, we were all incredibly disturbed by what we saw. And we weren't really expecting to see what we saw.
So the sequences you shot with this guy, which lead off your piece, perfectly establish this mood of creepy. It's kind of almost like a Hitchcock movie. You know something weird is going on, but you don't know what it is. And that's sort of, I thought that was brilliant in the way you framed your piece. I'd like to jump then to, we keep talking about orphanages, but it turns out that these are not really orphanages, in the sense that, in my understanding, the majority of these kids are actually not orphans. And so can you talk a bit about the the woman that you talked to who was sent to one of these orphanages by her parents, and why that happens, and talk a bit more then about why this is, you know, this is an industry more than a charity.
Julia, or do you want me to?
You can start, and yeah, go ahead.
So the woman that we spoke to was Immaculate, and she was, that was her name, sorry, her name was Immaculate, and she was, you know, one of these people who'd gone through the orphanage system, and there are a lot of families who desperately want their children to have a good education, poor families that don't have the means to be able to provide them with the level of education that they want to, and so there are these so-called orphanages, which are often run illegally and not registered, who tell these families that, look, if you come and give us your children, if your children come and stay with us, then they will get a good education, they'll be able to get their school certificates, and it will mean that they'll be Western people or people from various countries that will be able to fund your child, and they'll have a better quality of life. And the reality is that's very often not the case. And what actually happens are these children are used as pawns and props to show off to people and say, you know, look what we have, come and fund these individuals, and then the money is used somewhere else and doesn't actually go into helping these children. And so that's what happens. And I guess the reality is that a lot of this story is about the fact that there are, you know, families and children, they are the victims of all of this. And it's usually people from, and it always is actually people from very poor backgrounds who are being exploited.
And I guess we've all seen these commercials, you know, here, sponsor a child in, you know, some country in the developing world. They desperately need your help, $2 a week, or, you know, there are all these marketing ploys. But to see it from the other side, and to see how clearly a lot of this money never actually gets to these kids, it's diverted, and we get into the corruption issue later in your piece. But it sort of makes you think, oh my goodness, there's a whole other dimension to this, which we never saw. Joe, you were talking about the amounts of money that are involved in this. It's truly a global industry, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So some of the things that we were finding, like as you were saying, it is kind of like the business model is really clear, and you see it on all these different websites that are fundraising from Western donors. It's like, you know, they sort of have this model where you donate, you know, X number of dollars per child that you're sponsoring per month. And so it's really clearly incentivized that these people are supposed to sort of, you know, if you recruit orphans, if you gather, say it's $15 a month per orphan, and you can gather 100 orphans, and so you're making $1,500 a month off of foreign donations, you know, it's no one's looking into whether these kids are orphans or not. And I think that on the scale we're finding, you know, we're talking about millions of dollars in Uganda, and we're talking about millions more dollars if you know, there's also these tourism trips where people essentially come, and it's like either an aid group or a missionary group, or, you know, a group from a church that come and visit, and, you know, you play with a few orphan children in some kind of orphanage, and you help, or you build a well, or you do something, and then you go on a safari, and then you go home, and all that money is just constantly coming into the country. And I think that makes it really difficult. It's like, even like those incentives are kind of set up for everyone. It's a lot of money to be sort of trying to regulate and trying to prevent from coming to sort of an impoverished country. And, you know, one of the things that I think kind of what you're asking is, you know, this sort of model, that business that can exist, or like, you know, essentially looking to the West to donate to these kinds of charities, that just exists everywhere. It's, or I shouldn't say everywhere, that exists in all kinds of places. And a lot of the nonprofits that are sort of fighting that kind of corruption, you know, they're working in Uganda, but also they're set up in Kenya, they're set up in India and Nepal. There are people that are working in Haiti. So we found that, like, in many developing nations, this is something that is sort of, this is a type of exploitation that's taking place.
And just to add to that, actually, there are two issues here. Obviously, there's corruption on the ground, or people who are taking advantage of these children in these locations, who are trying to get money for their own benefit. But what a lot of organizations say that we've spoken to in Uganda, people, Ugandans who are working there, who are trying to help people or children and have their own legitimately run NGOs that are working from inside, they feel incredibly frustrated, being undermined by what they see as foreign donations or Western donations, which are being pumped into the system by, you know, well-meaning people who mean well, but they say it's kind of a surface level donation into a big problem. And so what their message was, a lot of the time that we spoke to them, was, you know, people need to really look at what they're doing, who they're giving money to, what hands it's going into, because otherwise what you're doing could be more harm than good. And that was a frustration that we felt with a lot of people that we spoke to.
Yes, and what's interesting also is that the heart of this, the so-called orphans, or these kids, many of whom are not orphans, but as you've described, have been sent to these orphanages to get an education, or at least hopefully to get an education by their parents. That these are the real victims. It's almost like human trafficking. It's not quite that bad, but they are the ones that are being used, because they are, you know, the cute little faces that you can take photographs and videos of and send back to the United States or Europe and say, look, here are the kids that you can help. There's something quite cold-hearted about that exploitation. I think that's the word that you used, Joe. Exploitation is a good one, because they are clearly being used. They're sort of a marketable commodity, and that's very sad. Julia, I want to ask you now about what is really the gold mine of your reporting and filming, which is the whole orphanage raid with Joshua and Boise. Talk to me about how you got into that, because this is the most extraordinary sequence in the whole story, that you basically got this guy incriminated on camera. But talk about how this all was set up. It's fantastic.
Yeah, well, Joe did a lot of the legwork with our local producer, Anna, like he mentioned, you know, working with the government for months to try and convince them to give us access to one of these raids. And, you know, as we got closer to our deployment, we made sure that we were in this part of the country when Joshua and Boise and his team were planning to raid one of these unregistered orphanages. And then when we actually met up with Joshua, you know, he's, you know, charming and a talker. At first, we felt good about everything, but after a few hours of having him walk us around the different administrative buildings and introducing us to pretty much everyone who we worked with, we realized that, you know, something wasn't right. He was trying to delay the trip to the orphanage that we were supposed to witness him close. And you know, he basically was trying everything he could not to do the job that, you know, is one of the main parts of his job as a probation officer. His job is to protect children and make sure that the children in his community are being cared for in an appropriate way. And the job we were supposed to do, which was document him doing his job. So it took, you know, in the end, it actually took some convincing from us, or some pushing of, you know, aren't you gonna like do the job that you're supposed to be doing today? And when we eventually were able to follow him there many hours after we were supposed to go to the orphanage, there was an immediate conflict. As we rolled into the plot of land, you know, we could see the managers of the orphanage get a little upset, and, you know, the argument inside, it was clear right off the bat that these managers had a lot of interactions with him, not just as a probation officer and, you know, a legal orphanage, but, you know, more than that. The argument inside went on for, you know, 45 minutes or so. And we, you know, while one of our DPs was inside, we were kind of outside watching this little building where, you know, which was on a big plot of land, and slowly, you know, a bunch of the employees started coming out. Someone had a machete. Kids were watching us. It was a super tense environment. And, you know, in the end, he basically tried to escape, just like he tried not to go in the first place, and pinned him down and, you know, forced him to reckon with, you're just going to leave these kids here who are here illegally after being accused of taking bribes to allow them to keep operating. But yeah, it was an incredibly incredibly tense time, and I wish that we had you know, twice as long for the piece, so we could have included more of the, you know, drama that unfolded there. And we actually also went back the next day. We weren't able to include that either, just to kind of hear more about their side, the orphanage's side of the story, and you know, basically from their point of view, and from the American volunteer we talked to who has visited that orphanage several times. Joshua was, you know, taking hundreds of dollars from them over, you know, multiple times, and that's a ton of money for an institution like that, you know, even if it is operating illegally. So yeah, it was tense, to say the least.
I mean, there's that great scene where the orphanage owner, or the manager, I guess, is screaming about how much money he's paid. I mean, literally he's giving figures. I paid this guy, what was it, 6 million Ugandan shillings or something. And you know, now he's asking me to shut it down. And I don't know, because he was speaking not in English. So I don't know if you guys knew what he was saying at the time, but it was clearly very dramatic. He's incriminating this guy on camera. And then Mboise, the guy who was meant to be shutting it down, he kind of creeps out. And then another brilliant reporting scoop was Hind. You followed him and you managed to talk to him through the car window. Talk a bit about that, because this was really quite you know, gotcha type journalism. It was very, very clever.
Well, as Julia said, the series of events that led to that moment, everything, our suspicions were piling up. So first of all, him saying, you go by yourselves and I'll meet you there, then not turning up, then being forced to go by his manager. And then that whole situation and the argument and the accusations, the very specific accusations of, I've been giving you this amount of money. And the fact that, combined with the fact that Mboise had been very shifty about going there in the first place, really made us think there is something wrong here. And the argument went on for quite a while. And we had a translator with us and we were asking people what's going on in there. And sometimes they were speaking in English and we could understand, but we had a gist. We knew that there were accusations that were taking place of blackmail and bribery. And not only that, and we don't, as Julia said, it would have been great to show more, but we went around the orphanage and we actually spoke to some of the employees there who came out and were working there, and there was a lot of children, and we spoke to some people and tried to, you know, first of all, so that they knew that we weren't threatening and so that they knew what we were doing, and then also to try and find out a little bit more about it. But when that transpired, that there seemed to be more going on here, and then suddenly, whilst we're talking to people at the orphanage, he's getting in the car and leaving the journalists there and about to drive off. So we just decided once again with the cameras to just roll up and say, what are you doing? You're leaving the children here. Like, I thought the whole point was that you're closing down these illegal orphanages in order to help the vulnerable children that shouldn't be there and aren't receiving the care that they're supposed to receive. So you're just going to leave, and these children are going to be in exactly the same situation. That is the reason why you're closing it down in the first place. So yeah, that didn't make sense, and that's why we ended up filming that. And you could tell he was very uncomfortable with it. But because we had these suspicions, because of the accusations that were being made, after that we did Julia contacted quite a number of orphanages that were in that particular region that was supposed to be under his jurisdiction, to find out whether the same thing had happened. And they were very afraid of speaking out. They didn't want to have their names publicly put out there, but we discovered that these accusations were not just a one-off, and that there were other places that had made similar accusations. And so what was happening was, on the government side, there was corruption in terms of, we'll keep your orphanage open, we'll let you keep it open even though it's illegal if you pay us this money. And then we asked him about that later on camera as well, which he denied.
So I should say, as we're talking here, if anyone who's watching has a question, feel free to either type it into the chat function on the side of your screen, or we can also put your voice. You can ask your question. I think Chad is standing by to take anyone who wants to ask a question to any of our panelists. But let me just ask a little bit more about this particular situation. You mentioned that at least one person had a machete when you arrived. or came with a machete. Did you feel personally threatened? Because effectively you were interrupting what was clearly a very lucrative business for this area. I don't know, it was a village or a township or whatever. They can hardly have looked on your presence as being helpful to them, to say the least. Did you feel physically threatened at all?
I mean, it's pretty scary if someone's holding a machete in front of you. But we could tell very quickly that that anger wasn't necessarily directed at us. It was directed at Boise and the government and the frustration of what was happening. And that's again not to say that, you know, obviously the people who are running this orphanage were not doing it legally, and there were a lot of questionable things that we saw. But there was evidence that the government was blackmailing them. And so they were very angry about that. They were upset and they were concerned. But actually very quickly, we spoke to them and they really, really wanted us to speak to them. And they actually invited us back the next day to film with them. And so really, you know, of course you're going to be concerned when you see a machete, but judging the situation and, you know, we had very good translator and driver with us who could also tell us whether this really was a situation where the anger was directed at us or the government. And we knew pretty quickly that actually their main concern wasn't us, it was what the government was doing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, we never felt directly threatened by Mboise either, but he clearly had the police on his side too. He was clearly a powerful figure in the community. The police also asked us for money for, you know, their trouble after. And so if anything, I think when the situation was over and we were reflecting, we kind of, you know, not like anyone is a necessarily a good guy here, but you know, Mboise definitely had a lot of power and had the police behind him. And he told us it was normal protocol to have officers accompany him on any raid because there is always the potential for violence. But, you know, afterwards, they're just thinking about how the cops approached us and asked us for money. I was wondering if that was true or if, you know, he was just trying to get as many people on his side involved as possible to kind of keep a check on us.
And you see in the interview with the government, when I ask him if he knows who Boise is, and his response is laughter, like he laughs in response to that question, which shows that number one, you know, this guy's infamous, and number two, they have an idea of his actions as well.
It was clear that the manager of the orphanage knew that he was effectively doing something that wasn't fully legal. But I didn't get the sense from him, or frankly anyone else, that they really thought they were doing anything wrong. It was just, this was another form of business that they had lucked into, and they were able to get money from Australia and the UK and US, whatever. And they were presumably paying money to, you know, the teachers that they had. And, you know, there was a little sort of business going on there. They just didn't want to be interfered with, right? It wasn't that they felt that, oh my goodness, you know, you're uncovering some awful, evil thing that we're doing here, right? It seemed there was a certain amount of cynicism there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it kind of goes back to the idea that a lot of people we spoke to don't really have much faith in the government to provide those services, which goes back to her character Immaculate, why she, you know, went to an orphanage even though she had parents, and why our, you know, the woman Barbara who donated to the orphanage we witnessed get raided or have the interaction with Mboise tell us that she's not going to stop donating money even though the orphanage is unregistered, because she doesn't believe that the Ugandan government is going to help these children. I think there's a pervasive sense that the government isn't going to help, so we're just going to do this on our own, whether it's, you know, right or wrong.
And I do think that's important.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Go ahead, Hind.
I do think that's important to pick up on in terms of what Julia was saying. Barbara, who was saying that I'm still going to fund them anyway. And there is this attitude that you'll see people still, you know, travel and visit these orphanages so that they can take pictures and so that they can help, even though they don't necessarily, or they almost certainly don't have the qualifications to deal with children that have been in vulnerable or traumatic situations. They might not have the, you know, legitimate teaching skills or, you know, the skills to be able to interact with children in these environments. And that still goes on. And, you know, despite the research that we've done, for example, there are people who will watch it and they will still go and do that. And I think that was the other side to it. The fact that on one hand, there's exploitation that's taking place in Uganda, but on the other hand, there is a feeling that some people who were going and traveling and working in these orphanages were also exploiting these young children, and that was an important aspect to highlight as well.
So I can see there's a question from William Holstein. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I first want to get to this final character who's almost like out of a Graham Greene novel. This is the government official who, I guess he supervises this industry or whatever, whom you interview in his office in Kampala, right? And he's quite a likable guy in a sense. He has these sort of very affecting mannerisms, very humorous fellow. But he's basically saying, what do you want me to do, right? He knows about the corruption, but he said, well, that's the way things are here and I can't change it. So I'll investigate this, but he kind of leaves it. I mean, I don't know. Did you have a sense that his investigation was going to go very far and stop all this abuse? Either Hind or Julia, do you have a sense of that?
I think a lot of the places that we end up covering in, you see certain things, or you might see government corruption, or you might see injustices, and eventually there's a feeling of frustration that, you know, what will actually change and will they actually do anything? And I think, you know, there was a small hope that we had that action would be taken against Boise at least, or action would be taken to try and stop any potential blackmailing that was taking place. But it's very difficult to really change something. You can't just put a plaster on top of a wound. You know, you really need to go to the core of it, and that takes a lot and is very difficult. But he did promise to do something about Boise. I think Julia can explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we followed up with him for a few months after we got back to the States and the UK respectively. And, you know, he kept assuring me that in Boise was under investigation, that they had, you know, paused his, you know, certain parts of his job while they were investigating him. But then that's as far as it got. And I think, you know, by the time we aired the piece, we learned that we had the distinct sense that he wasn't going to get fired. And, you know, that was part of the way it went. Also, back to his Boise's manager in the, you know, local area we were in, his colleague who was above him in Boise was married to that guy's daughter. So there, you know, there were so many levels to get through before, you know, he could actually be held to account. And that was just the reality, unfortunately.
So we got a
just
couple
very quickly, and I think, sorry, it's really important to say, the woman in the purple dress, who was one of the other officers that was working with him, and you see her in that clip, she was wonderful. You have to say, like, she spoke to us about some of the issues that they face, and she really, really did seem to care about the children that she works with. So that's also just to highlight that, you know, there is a lot of corruption, of course, but there are also really incredible people who work within a system, within a very difficult system, to try and do the best that they can do. And I think, you know, those people are, you know, really, really need to be noted. Yeah,
sure. Human beings are human beings in the end of the day. A lot trying to do their best. So there's some questions from some of our viewers. William Holstein is asking, of all you panelists, where are all three of you based? How did you get permission from top producers to devote so much time and resources to this project? And how long did it take you to do the reporting? He has another question, but if maybe you could just give us a sense of where you all are and how you indeed got to do spend so much time on a story that was really not something that would have been on most people's radar. I would suggest. Joe, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So I'm based in New York. If you don't mind, I'll just say, like, Julia and I are both based in New York, and we work in the same office. And then Hind is based in the London bureau. And so for when we deployed, when the field teams went, Julia and another DP from New York went to Uganda along with Hind and another DP from London. So it's nice we kind of had the two meet. For the amount of time, it really took the initial investigation and all the phone calls and all the production work that it took to set all these elements up. I think actually 4 months. And it was a huge amount of time. And it's interesting because at times I felt a little bit embarrassed. Like, our bosses had, they expected us to be delivering some kind of package that had not been delivered. And, the story was greenlit, but the amount of work that went into actually getting it off the ground was like enormous. So I think there were times that, it felt we needed to rush it, or it felt that we needed to wait for the right time. And I think, half of it was possible to spend that much time, I think, because we sort of trusted that it was worth waiting for the right access. And also because we had other things going in the background. So I know all three of us were delivering other stories and working on other things with this sort of simmering in the background the whole time.
Well, I have to say kudos to your bosses, just that they gave you the leeway to do this, because, with news budgets under so much pressure these days, the very idea of sending a crew to Uganda to do a story that people hadn't heard of, that's great. And you produce the goods, it's fantastic. But the other part of his question was, did your piece have any policy impact either on the ground or among the NGOs? And that's a big question. And I don't know who wants to take it on, Julia or Joe or Hind, but it is a big, you've done this story now. Has it had any impact?
Julia, I was going to say maybe you should answer this one too.
Well, I guess we sort of touched on it in the discussion about the final scene of the piece, in that we were hoping for a tangible result of Mboise being fired, and that didn't happen. I think this piece came about in a climate where there has been a little bit more attention on this industry. Like Joe mentioned at the beginning, building on some reporting that a local reporter has done on how these orphanages feed into illegal adoptions. And so the government there was a new law passed a couple of years ago in Uganda to better regulate orphanages. And the raid we tried to follow came out of that. We didn't have, a direct policy impact, as in because of our piece, the government said they're doing something differently. But our hope is that it's contributing to this discussion and body of work about the problems with an industry like this. And then, on the other hand, I hope that anyone who sees this just thinks a little harder about the types of charities they volunteer with or donate to. The best thing would be to come out of it for me is that if, Westerners who watch this and were thinking about going to donate or volunteer in developing countries took a second look and did a lot more research before doing so.
Joe, you can come in, but there's another question relevant to this, which is from T. Ferguson, who said, are the Western charities connected to these orphanages? And the orphanages are in inverted commas. Are they charities that we would recognize, or are they obscure fly-by-night ones, which speaks to what you're just saying, Julia? Joe, do you want to talk to that? These charities, are they unknown charities, or do we know who they are?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad that's a really good question, because that's exactly what I wanted to kind of add to what Julia was saying as well. So these organizations, there's a lot of ways that they work. Some of them are just, it's a Ugandan organization that is donated to by foreigners and by individuals or churches. Some of them are Western organizations that set up or partner with a Ugandan charity. So it might be, it's quite common for an American NGO to be based somewhere in Louisiana or somewhere in, Houston, and for them to just have another organization that they've partnered with and helped to incorporate, and they think that the paperwork's in order, and they just funnel money essentially from donors that they are in connection with. And then some of these organizations are just Western run. Like there are really, really big international NGOs that are based in Uganda. And it's interesting because typically the really large international groups, I don't want to necessarily name names, but there are certain really big international orphanages that are based all over the world that have headquarters in Uganda. And those are typically the orphanages that are registered or are sort of legally operating. And I think that it was interesting because a lot of the people we spoke to had similar complaints or had similar, doubts about most of the organizations that were operating in Uganda. But I have a feeling that because of the size and scale of those kinds of operations, they were getting, they were able to get sort of legitimized. And so I don't know, it's interesting. I would be interested to talk more with some of like local, sort of philanthropists that are based in Uganda or Ugandan philanthropists about if they think that, there's any kind of different treatment of when foreigners come and bring some kind of aid organization versus when locals are trying to set something up.
So I wonder, in your reporting, Julia and Hind on the ground, did you visit any of these better known or branded orphanages? Were there orphanages that you felt were being run responsibly and you're looking after the kids and giving them the education that they needed? Or were you sort of suspicious of all the orphanages that you were exposed to?
We did go to one place that was, they called themselves a boarding school, but they were also getting Western donations, and they had children that would stay over, but their argument was that the children would go home during term time, and so therefore it was a boarding school and not an orphanage. But I think that was just a technicality in order to get around the law as well. And the reality is we don't actually know if that place was legal or illegal. We tried to dig around, but from what we saw, it certainly looked like the children were treated well. They had a uniform, there were classrooms with a lot of art in there, and they seemed to be a lot happier, and they had a big playground, and they were fed better. And so we did see that there were places like that did have backing, Western backing, but also I guess the key issue is one of the people that donated, they actually traveled to Uganda a couple of times a year to see it. But then also we don't know what happens when she's not there, or when our cameras aren't rolling. And so I'm sure that there are some places that will give children a better quality education. But also this place in particular I'm talking about, some of the children who can afford it will pay. And so that is used to subsidize the children that can't afford it. But then there are so many more that are just off the grid, that you might just find a Facebook page with 10 members, but they've actually got lots of children in the orphanage. And like what we found when we were on the ground is that there are just so many of them that you wouldn't be able to find a website for, or you wouldn't be able to find any details about that exist.
And just to add to that, I think, obviously there are hundreds of orphanages that are registered in addition to the hundreds that are not in Uganda. But as we witnessed, corruption is rampant there, as it is in, most countries. And so we came away at the end with the sense that even the registered orphanages might not be doing, the best for these children. And an aspect of this report that we weren't able to go into as much as we had hoped is the kind of psychological impact on children who are in orphanages, especially when volunteers cycle through to visit, which happens at registered orphanages as well as at unregistered ones. So I think the unregistered orphanages are particularly pernicious for obvious reasons, but the whole ecosystem, I mean, the country is just so full of orphanages, and putting children who have parents in institutions, that is this, you know, that's a system that seems like it doesn't give a net benefit. Yeah.
And just to pick up from that, going back to the first conversation that we had about that orphanage that we walked into, with the man the Canadian man who was working there, the interaction of the children with us, with the foreigners who walked in, they would try and hold our hands. They were trying to hug us. It was like they had been taught to do that, or that's what they were used to doing when they'd see foreigners. The way that they performed for us, it was disturbing. And as Julia was saying, there is clearly like a huge psychological impact of children being put in these vulnerable situations with people who just aren't qualified. And, you know, people who come thinking that they're doing something that's helping children. It's happening not just in Uganda and in other places. And yeah, it's something that we spoke about a lot, and we definitely wish we could have covered that more.
So I can see, I have another question in the chat room from Kimberly Nielsen, but I wonder, Chad, do you have anyone waiting who wants to ask a question live in the amongst our participants?
I do not have anyone asking to be on microphone.
Well,
yeah.
If anyone has a question they want to ask you, please raise your hand. But I have one more question here from Kimberly Nielsen. It's a good one. She says, is there any chance that you guys could now do a piece about the US charities? In other words, the other side of the story.
Actually, do you mind? I want to say a couple of things to this. So first of all, one impact that we had, this is kind of going back to the various impacts we had after the story came out. One of the biggest impacts is that the majority of the missionary groups and different, you know, US-based charities that I was talking to in advance for the shoot seem to have stopped answering my messages. So I don't know exactly what.
Funny,
you know,
that.
So I think that it's possible that we've burned a few bridges just based on what our story ended up being about. I think that, you know, it is really interesting. And I think that Anna Cavell, the local journalist, or the British journalist that we worked with who was based in Kampala, I know that she's done, like, there was a print piece that she published about a certain, it's been a while since I've read it, but I just remember that it was about a certain, you know, British man who was using the auspice of charities to go to Uganda and abuse children. And it was this excellent investigation. And it was, you know, a horrific story. And so I think that there's definitely a lot of work to do. Like, I think that there's a lot to still be talked about, both in terms of, you know, exploitation and abuse, and the way that this money, I mean, exploitation of people donating as well. Like, I'm interested in talking more about it, but it's not quite clear, like, how to do that just yet, or what the story might be.
We had talked yesterday about another film that was, longer film that was made in Uganda, came out in 2013. It's called God Loves Uganda, and it was made by Roger Ross Williams. And that was a story of the intense homophobia in Uganda, and I guess that's seen in other African countries as well, and frankly, many parts of the world. But in Uganda, it reached such an extreme that the government was actually debating punishing homosexual behavior with the death penalty. Literally, people could have been sent to execution for engaging in homosexual acts. Now, this film, and you guys, I think have all seen it, showed the link between American evangelical Christian organizations and this political movement in Uganda. So there were these very conservative Christian organizations in the US who were acting as missionaries in Uganda and were pushing this anti-gay, homophobic message, which had got to the very top levels of government. Now, the effect of that film was to so embarrass the Ugandan government that they actually reversed their policy. And so I would call that a win for documentary journalism, if you like. And I guess the hope would be that what you have started here might also, you know, you're not going to change the world entirely. And I understand that this orphanage business operates not just in Africa, but also you mentioned India, Nepal, and so on. So it's a huge business. But but that it might start some process where people say, you know what, we got to clean this up too. I don't know, this is more longer term, but I don't know if you're optimistic there that you might have started something. I hope you have.
Yeah, I'll just say, well, first of all, just back to a previous question, your mention of God Loves Uganda reminded me of it. A huge amount, I can't say for sure majority, but it seemed like to us, of the orphanages who had partners internationally were sponsored by churches. The US evangelical movement in Uganda still is a huge foothold there. I think, you know, there are a lot of people in the Ugandan government and in the country who want this practice to end. But, you know, as we witnessed, it's not as simple as changing a law, because the laws now are much stricter in terms of regulating orphanages. It seemed to us that it's more about, you know, enforcement and changing a culture of corruption, which again is in pretty much every country in the world. It's really hard to uproot a system that's so deeply ingrained in education, in the way, you know, people there see white people as, you know, their best chance for getting out of poverty, even though, you know, it's clearly not the case. So I definitely am hopeful, but I think there's just, it's going to take so much, kind of.
Joe, did you have something to say?
Yeah, sorry, this is one more thought on this, is that there actually is a movement already that we didn't start. I mean, there in Uganda, there's a group of people that they call themselves alternative care, and it's many different sort of, you know, teachers and childcare workers. And it's a big group that they're essentially trying to promote the idea that, you know, a child doesn't need to find an orphanage or some kind of institutionalized care. What they need more so is family. And so they're really strong advocates for, you know, taking, you know, actual orphans who actually don't have parents and placing them in other families or homestays, or, you know, like situations where they actually get individual attention instead of being sort of in a group of 100 kids with 2 caregivers. And I think that's an interesting movement that's definitely not getting the kind of support that, you know, some of these just orphanages do, that really do market like very sad looking children.
Well, let me just wrap this up by saying that all the jurors for the David Kaplan Award loved your piece. It was really outstanding, you know, foreign journalism at its best. I do think that it will have an effect. You know, you've mentioned some of the organizations that are trying to change this, and you're going to give them a lot of extra support, I think, by doing this piece. So congratulations, Joe, Julia, and Hind. I'm looking forward to seeing what your next projects will be. And let me now hand it back to Patricia from the Overseas Press Club.
Yes, thank you, Terry and Hind and Julia and Joe. It was a really fascinating conversation. And I too look forward to your future stories.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.